Now we move on to Mr. Gamal Moharam, speaking of the private sector and the private sector taking initiatives on how to benefit from the carbon. Really touch upon the area of compensation, which we've been talking about. So I invite my very good friend and distinguished banker and businessman, Mr. Gamal Moharam, to speak.
Well, thank you, Abla. First, let me say a statement that I learned a lot during the last an hour and a half from the three speakers. A lot of questions I did have, and they did give me the answer. Sherif is smiling because Sherif and I have been working on this for the last 2 years, and I will give him a part of my speech to end up my say. Dr. Samir mentioned that they were talking the same language. This time, or my presentation will not be the same language. We are two old entrepreneurs that about a year and a half came up with an idea, and we worked on it. And sure enough, it's cooking, and we got a lot of attention. And it's really an idea that it could be repeated in all the African countries. We will start in Egypt. We have a partner. Unfortunately, there is a lot of details because we are in the process of the FRA, our regulator, to establish the fund. Details of the funds will not be something to discuss. But let me start by quoting the Egypt National Climate Change Strategy 2050, that Egypt really is one of the most populated nations in the Middle East and Africa. And the country is therefore highly vulnerable to the effects of climate change, and adapting to the adverse impact of the climate change really is an imperative necessity for us. Air pollution costs Egypt about $47 billion. So multiple government-led programs are development, finance, and private sector support. However, more measures are really needed, and the challenges are big. Egypt is investing in urban transport networks. The renewable comprise an estimate of 10% of the energy mix. The government is aiming 42% by 2035, which is not, of course, an easy task, but I think it will be achievable. COP27 is on our doorsteps. I think the strategic imperative of COP27 is implementation, as I heard it from Dr. Samir as well. Meeting the commitments made in Paris and Glasgow to the developing economies to mobilize at least 100 billion per year from public and private sources dedicated to meeting climate target is now widely questionable ahead of COP27. Of course, these commitments are meant to finance both mitigation and adaptation for the developing economies. Of course, with the current global economic landscape, with the inflation, rising cost of finance, fiscal tightness, and all the problems that everybody is facing, the division of shares between the public and private sector is not really something. Realistic progress in COP27 from the private sector, and that for adaptation, of course, should come from the public ones, as Dr. Samir mentioned as well. The idea is that financing for the mitigation makes business sense, sourced privately, and to the adaptation. The idea, when it comes to Sherif and I as MGM, we have with us Avance Capital. They are a private equity fund. And we came up with an idea that it's the first fund of its kind for generating carbon offsets or carbon emissions. The investors will receive carbon offsets, which they can either claim to meet their obligation or trade against a monetary value in open markets. The carbon offsets allow organizations to achieve net zero emissions by offsetting emissions that they can reduce by other means. The fund will aim to invest in projects in Egypt, and as such, all carbon offsets will be made in Egypt. Of course, it can be replicated again in Africa, in any other country. We are planning to have two parallel funds, one in Egypt, based in Egypt, in Egyptian pound, and the other one is in dollars, and it will be domiciled outside of Egypt. We are looking to finance 12 to 15 projects, raising money maybe in a project. Let me turn the video off, maybe it will be. Okay, we were seeking to finance 15 projects, as in fuel switching, carbon capture, adoption of clean energy. I will give this, I will let Sherif talk a little bit about the pipeline, because he's the one who really worked on it. Really, the project are structured to pay back the financing in the form of VARs only, or VARs in cash, depending on the financing arrangement made for each investment. The fund will follow the gold standard. This is something that the three speakers talked about, the gold standard. For the VAR, the value is in tons, but it will be multiplied by the price. The price is determined at the time of delivery of the VARs to the investors in the fund. And it's worth mentioning that the Egyptian Stock Exchange is in the process of establishing a carbon offset commodity exchange, which can also be one of the options for a benchmark to determine the price of the VAR certificates, which is the big challenge that we have to solve very soon. And I will pass the mic and the floor to Sherif, maybe to tell you a little bit about the pipeline, the project pipeline that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gamal. Thank you so much. Before you pass on to Sherif, please unmute yourself, Sherif. I want to introduce him. Mr. Sherif ElDiwany is a prominent businessman, economist, and a great friend. And he was actually my predecessor in this place. So he's now talking at home, always home for you, Sherif. Please
Thank you so much, Dr. Abla. There's so much to say. I have to say, I mean, I was initially joining to contribute to what Gamal just said, but the discussion has been very rich, and I want to thank you for organizing this discussion, and also to thank you for specifically for asking the question which is still remained unanswered in this discussion, which is referring to what has been called the climate justice. Basically, how can we help countries like Egypt, Africa, and other emerging economies who have not caused the climate crisis, but rather have been victim or are becoming victims of it. And I have been saying since a few months now, since we started talking about or thinking about the project, Gamal and I, that Egypt is not a big polluter, it's actually a big victim. So is the case with many of countries like us. However, mitigation, what the carbon markets that we have been discussing since the beginning of this session are actually designed for financing mitigation. And as you have rightly mentioned, Dr. Abla, this is not the only thing that we should be concerned about. We should look at mechanisms to finance adaptation. How can we make it possible for financial flows to be available to finance adaptation? Now, unless carbon market designs and the conventions, starting from the Kyoto Protocol and what has been presented regarding the organization of carbon markets, unless it's redesigned to specifically allow, for example, what has been mentioned regarding the benchmark, and you asked a very relevant question for forests in Africa. They have been offsetting, and they will continue to offset. But the concept of additionality, which was presented by Fenella in the beginning, is one of the stumbling blocks in actually generating a new stream of revenue that could become a source for adaptation. And so unless the carbon markets regulation, international regulations are designed, we will remain working with such carbon markets to finance mitigation only, exclusively. But as also mentioned by Gamal, we are now in a global environment where the financing is becoming more difficult than it was when we were in Glasgow, and even more complex than when we were in Paris. And the commitments made will be very difficult to meet. So it's actually good to have funds such as ours and mitigation mechanisms, financing mechanisms that the one presented today, to be able to relieve some of the demand on finance, so it can be directed to adaptation. So private sector assumes a bigger share of mitigation financing as long as the business case is there, and at the same time have concessional financing or public money available for adaptation to help countries like us and African countries and other countries around the world deal with the adaptation challenges, which are very serious, and it's actually quite a serious climate injustice. So I thank you for asking the question, and I wanted to share these thoughts with you in a way, suggesting that you should have another session around how can we finance adaptation exclusively. I mean, carbon markets right now either need to be redesigned, or we have to look at how can we make adaptation projects bankable or financially sustainable through risk mitigation, whatever mechanism. We should discuss this separately in another session. Now, to the project that I'm working with Gamal on, and why it's relevant for countries like Egypt, and especially in urban centers. We will be financing mitigation, which is relevant still, although we are not big polluters, but we still have our own domestic challenges. I would call it microclimate challenges. Our urban centers are heavily polluted, our delta urban centers as well, storage of water, waste management issues in the country, and so on. So the fund aims to raise private capital to finance projects that will reduce emissions. I will give two examples that are quite sufficient for the moment, but this is the model that has been used in generating a pipeline, which is now approaching £1 billion Egyptian pounds worth of investment that can generate offsets in the shape of returns to the investors who will come with us in the fund. One example, and a very promising one, is in the transport sector, where we are talking about or discussing with a number of companies that own passenger transportation fleets. And there is a reason why we are talking about passenger, because cargo is the technology has yet to be developed to be effective in terms of cost and logistics to be able to retrofit trucks carrying cargo, which is also quite a substantial contributor. Yet it's possible to do the retrofitting from diesel and petrol engines to electric vehicles, electric motors in these vehicles. We're also dealing with fleets for a simple reason, at least for the moment, because the infrastructure for recharging is yet to be developed in Egypt, although it has been starting and it's starting to emerge, but yet it's not possible for any owner of a vehicle to retrofit and rely on an infrastructure for charging their vehicles. So we deal with fleets because at the end of the day, the fleets goes back to one location where the charging can happen. And we will be financing the retrofitting of the vehicles, and the deal would be that basically in return for the finance, we will be getting the carbon credits as explained by Gamal, and the will be verified as also mentioned. The process follows very much what Fenella mentioned at the beginning, which is we are using the gold standard. We have already set up in place an arrangement for verification and validation and certification by Gold Standard and its sister institutions. And that will be the way it works. So we will have the auditor audit the emission offsets, which we will then, the property of which will be then transferred to the fund and then give it to the investor who invests with us in the shape of return. This one example is retrofitting. The second one, which is my favorite one because it's enormously promising, is the recycling of PET bottles, the single-use plastic bottles. I am really in debt. We are really in debt to Dr. Laila Skandar, who has developed this concept and has already tested it. It's been rolling out for close to 2 years, and I think Dr. Abla knows about it very well. The beauty of this solution is that not only does it achieve emission reduction by offsetting the need to produce virgin PET, but also that the fact that actually generates jobs for poor and specifically women who are very much active in the collection system that Dr. Laila has designed and developed and tested. And currently we have been in discussion with her for a number of months now, and extremely impressive model that she had developed with huge logistics dealing with large number of tonnage of PET and very promising growth potential. I mean, I don't think I should take more time, Dr. Abla, but these are the points. My first point is, let us please work together to see how we can design or redesign rather the carbon markets, or find another in another session and another roundtable dedicated only to adaptation to answer the question that you raised, which I share. I sincerely share the concern that you raised. So I think we should do that. And the second, then I explained some examples of the project that we will be financing and the impact from actually the value that returns to countries like us is not the contribution to climate action globally, because we are not big polluters, but we're actually doing this also for our selfish reasons, basically cleaning our urban environments and our landscape to make it a better quality of life for Egyptians.
Thank you so much, Sherif. It's okay to be selfish in this area, because we do need to deal and move to green industry. I was hoping to catch more details on what's being cooked on the stove, but the smell is good, and hopefully we are going to listen to the whole thing and see the actual announcement during the COP itself. Okay, so I was going to drag more from Sherif, but I'm being nice to my good friend Jimmy, and I'm not going to push for more. See how kind I am at the end of the day.
You are a gentle lady for sure.
Yeah, you owe me that one. All right. And extremely important, of course, on the adaptation, and not just on the medication and the climate justice. And this was meant to be a bit of a focus of attention, but interestingly enough, the entire system that exists in the carbon market okay? One has to understand how it operates to see how to move to that. And it's not designed for climate justice. It's designed for mitigation by everybody, rich and poor. But the issue is the ones who are doing the emissions, okay? 2 countries in the world are responsible for at least 40% of the emissions, if not more. Everybody else needs to be compensated. There is a role for international organizations there, okay? Let me ask the audience if they have questions to please raise their hand. But until they do, I want to ask Ms. Fenella, you're still with us here, right? And yes, hello there. All right. If you're such an expert and you are with the carbon market and you are on the negotiating table on our behalf, okay, there is a need to do some bridging of some kind. There is a need to more blend the climate finance to the carbon market as it operates commercially, okay? What would you ask for as a top priority? If you are on the negotiating table and you have a say and you want to seek the justice to be part of the game, we all need to get cleaner and everything. But if we are to introduce justice, what can you tap on as a starting point? Very, quickly, because we have some hands raised, so just give me a thought. Or I can leave you a little bit to think about it if you want. And
that's
would you prefer
fine.
that?
No, that's fine. I can answer
okay,
now. Look, I'm going to be quite controversial here because I don't think Africa needs to or should just say give. There's a trade there. So I think there should be, and there is, I'll just put it in the chat, there is a share of proceeds set aside specifically for adaptation in every single trade that will happen in the carbon markets. And even though it doesn't apply to Article 6.2, it will voluntarily, almost definitely by most buyers, be applied. I would say it would be good if we don't change Article 6 now. It's taken 10 years to agree it. So don't try and muck it up because you want to get the markets open and trading, first of all. Then you should have, for adaptation, really the loss and damage conversation is a separate conversation. Keep it separate. Don't confuse it with markets, but have that conversation. Have it. And as you've said, have a separate session on it, as I think Sherif recommended. That is a real conversation. But also, as I say, I put in the chat as well, don't forget, and you mentioned it already, Sherif, in this waste project, that there are other benefits to doing mitigation projects, job creation, environmental, air pollution improvements. Focus on those. Focus on making sure that you generate programs with the most sustainable development benefits you can, because that will effectively address the effects of a lot of the effects of climate change. Not all of them, I recognize that. But I think if you can ensure sustainable development aspects, and that's where push the rules, make sure that you can't go greenwashing, make sure that in the negotiations that no one's able to undermine a price. You want to generate a market with the highest price possible. And that means the most sustainable benefits possible to Egypt and the countries of Africa. And Africa has massive potential. Also, push for always more capacity building and more funding for technical assistance, because that is what Africa needs at the moment. And that is where you're going to be able to get out of the starting gates now, get help to get out of the starting gates and get the markets going. So that's what I would be pushing for. I leave it there.
Thank you so much, Fenella. And I mean, I see the wisdom in what you're saying. I mean, it took them 10 years to reach Article 6. Let's not mess it up. And let us look at this other one separately, and I think separately is going to happen with a change in the economic system in the world and division of power, because this is actually the core issue. We need a new economic order, I think, where the division of voices and the game of power is not more balanced. This is what's going to bring the compensation at the climate is only one aspect. There is a lot more to it than that. Mr. Amr, please go ahead. Mr. Amir, sorry, Amir Gergis. Okay.
So first, I'd like to thank you for this opportunity, great info and the discussion, and it's been a really bridge for connecting different people working on the same topic. If it is one thing, answering your question, that I would bring to the negotiating table is the power of the voluntary carbon markets. This is where we can mobilize the might of the Fortune 2000s with net zero goal in investing in the transition of developing countries. And that is what I believe is missing in Africa. Most of the voluntary offsets, it might be developed in maybe forestry and maybe RED projects, but I believe that each multinational working in a developing country should have a minimum percentage of its offsets being reinvested in that country. And this is what we're calling for. So if you're PepsiCo, if you're Nestle, if you're Schlumberger, if you're whatever you are, you're operating in Egypt, and part of your strategy is going to be offsetting, for example, 100,000 tons because of your operations in Egypt, at least a minimum percent that we can negotiate should be invested inside that country. And this brings what Dr. Sherif ElDiwany was saying, just transition. The operations is happening in that country, the offsetting should happen inside that country. And this is the one thing I would actually bring to the negotiating table. And thank you again. And I'm hopeful that I can get to connect with all the amazing people here. I believe that we can create a lobby in doing more in creating the carbon markets for mitigation and adaptation.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you so much for your comment and for what you said. And I think it's very useful. And I encourage you to send more to the center in writing if you want, because we are going to produce a short document, very precise, on the things that we need in order to be able to move forward, and advise and send it to the African delegates and the presidency and see how we can push it. So if you have more suggestions, I'd be more than happy to do that. Let me go just one last thing, go back again to Dr. Samir Amos, and I want to ask him the same question I asked Ms. Fenella, which is, what would you bring to the negotiating table in COP27 now in order to push more for the climate justice? Play on the thing, which seems to be not only sensitive, but not clearly on the agenda. Adaptation in general is not on the agenda. And this is something that we mentioned before early on in the webinar, is that for the mitigation, there are targets, we're putting numbers. Adaptation, you're not measuring anything, all right? And there is an unfairness that does exist. So what would you bring on the table? A quick thought.
Thanks a lot. Many things have been said by Fenella earlier, but you establishing the rule in the country means that the country would have the possibility to say that all carbon emission certificates would bring some resources, financial resources, to project proponent, and the authorities might decide to retain part of these resources so that they could invest in adaptation actions. So this is the decision of the authorities to do that. On the other hand, the authorities should know that they should give a good balance between retaining some resources from the mitigation or selling emission reductions and the market. We are in a competitive market. in the international market. That means if some countries in Latin America or in Asia would not retain any resources from selling emission reduction, that means you might not be present in the market if you go ahead with the retaining important parts of emission reductions sold. So there is it's important for a country to know a good balancing between ensuring that part of the resources are going to go to adaptation, and I agree with you that adaptation is a very important parameters for African country. But on the other side, mitigation also is very important, but because transition to new technologies would help adapting to giving better responses to adaptation problems. Like, for example, reforestation would give opportunity for better managing water, better managing species that would be resilient to climate change. And so there is maybe a known linkage between mitigation and adaptation that we should take into account in the way the country is getting into a carbon market. So we have to do complementing strategies and measures between adaptations and mitigation, knowing that we are in a competitive market, and any country should have this overview of these links between mitigation, adaptation, while at the same time balancing these things according to the market needs.
Thank you very much, Dr. Samir. Sherif, you want to add something? You have your hand raised, or
Yes,
it's
allow me.
previous?
No,
okay.
no, it's not an old one. It's a new one. I actually have become a very well trained user of Zoom, so I lower my hand eventually when I get through. I want just for the record, very quickly, Abla. For Fenella, I understand the huge sunk political investment that has been invested in the development of Article 6, and I think maybe the time is not now for sure. I agree, it's not now too, but we have to recognize the fact that it's not designed for climate justice. So just for the record. The second point, Dr. Abla, regarding what we are learning now. So the question is, how can we make mitigation markets or carbon markets more effective in realizing mitigation targets of each country? Case in point is Egypt. And we have learned something, Gamal and I, working with a number of projects that we're working with. Some of the trade policies we have in Egypt are actually acting against the financing of mitigation through mechanisms such as ours, or through the voluntary carbon market at large. The example I have in mind is that the duties on electric vehicles, the rationale of government is, we are importing electric vehicles, that we give them some incentive, but there's still the duties on some of the technologies that we are referred to. We're just talking about now with Mr. Anous. He talked about technology transfer for mitigation. So every project that we have has a component of technology imported internationally, and we found that in many cases these are subject to duties that are actually raising the price of the investment in the offsetting. And I really think we should ECES is in a very good position of making recommendations for such reforms to improve the competitiveness of investment in offsetting activities, whether through funds like ours or any voluntary market mechanisms that I'm sure will emerge eventually. I hope I made my point clear.
No, your point is very clear. And like I said, sophisticated governments are needed to benefit from the systems. And all governments are maturing, including ours. All right. So we do need a lot of reform. We're promoting reform all the time. Even aside from the carbon market as such, moving to green technology, moving to new technology, moving to digitization, the system, the ecosystem needs to support this, okay, which is not always happening. But hopefully things are going to improve and we'll get there.
But you know,
in
case of, I'm sorry, just to have the case of electricity of electric vehicles, the vehicle itself has a reduced duty, but then the components of a retrofitting an existing vehicle has duties which raises the cost. And the rationale is
again, you're missing my point, Sherif. I said maturity. It's a matter of maturity.
I am going to help them mature. I mean, the point I'm making is they are paying subsidy to diesel fuel. The government, we are paying subsidy to diesel fuel, which will be removed if we retrofit. So there will be savings. So there's no need to raise duties on components coming in to retrofit vehicles because we will save.
I agree with you completely. Okay, I agree with you completely. Our time is up. Thank you so much for an incredible session. Extremely useful. I want to thank again my speakers, Mrs. Fenella, Iona, and Dr. Axel, and Dr. Samir, and Dr. Gamal, and Mr. Sherif, and also Mr. Amir for a good suggestion. And I'm waiting for something written from you. I thank all of you. And I want to thank the African Capacity Building Foundation for actually helping with the bringing forward, specifically Mrs. Fenella. So we're so glad that you are with us, and this was extremely useful. And I also want to thank my very good friend, Mr. Slim Platley, my Tunisian friend and ex-Minister of Tourism in Tunisia, for actually helping bring to us the high expertise of Dr. Samir Amos. I thank you all, and looking forward to seeing you in the remaining webinars. There are 3 that are actually left. One on the adaptation plans of the different countries, given their different levels of development. One on the early warning on natural disasters, which is actually going to be next week. And the last one on youth. We are going to bring youth from Egypt and Africa to see how did they see this whole damn story about the climate. And I'm sure they're going to say things that are completely different from what we are saying, because they're seeing things from a different angle altogether. Thank you so much, and I look forward to seeing you all. The recording of the webinar itself is going to be on the website and on our page on Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitter and you name it, all over the world. And we're going to also produce the small document with the key messages that we are going to pass on. Until I see you next time. Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye now.